Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Debating climate alarmists is like playing chess with a pigeon. They knock all the pieces down and then strut around like they won the game. I'm going to show you a couple examples of this from Twitter this week. I wrote, "The concept that people can prevent fires via taxes or restricting air travel is as ludicrous as any idea from the Dark Ages." Someone named Will Kelly wrote back, "The idea that sickness is caused by tiny animals living inside a person is as ludicrous as any idea from the Dark Ages. Just because you don't understand the mechanism that causes something doesn't mean it's a lie. Climate science is complex. That's why I trust scientists." His argument basically boils down to the idea that, because some things are true, any crazy idea put out there by climate alarmists is also true. The medical theme he threw out there is a non sequitur. It has nothing to do with climate. He didn't present any evidence which disputed or was even related to my assertion. At the bottom he says, "Climate science is complex. That's why I trust scientists." The primary spokesperson for climate alarmism is a 17-year-old girl who doesn't attend school and has no background in science. Climate alarmists choose to ignore scientists like myself and trust anyone who agrees with their position. There's no substance to Will Kelly's tweet. He's supporting an absurd idea that you can prevent fires via taxes or restricting air travel. Any person who supports an idea so ludicrous is not worthy of being called a scientist. Now let's move on to another conversation which I had yesterday about Arctic sea ice. I tweeted this animation yesterday showing how Arctic sea ice extent is growing rapidly. It's in the normal range. It's above the 2011 to 2019 average, and it's also above the 2001 to 2010 average. What's going on in the Arctic is a complete disaster for climate alarmists. The conversation was very complex and involved several people. Someone posted this graph showing how Arctic sea ice had declined since 1979. So a skeptic tweeted back to him, "I have a feeling you might just earn yourself a video on pre-1979 ice extent." And I tweeted back, "The more interesting topic about Arctic sea ice is what's going on in the year 2020. Climate alarmists are facing a catastrophe for their scam." Someone named Mervin weighed in and said, "What on earth are you muttering about?" And he posted a graph purporting to show a linear decline in Arctic sea ice extent since 1979. So I tweeted back to him and asked why he was hiding the pre-1979 satellite data. And note at the bottom that Twitter blocked the image which I posted. This is what most people see when they look at my tweets. Twitter has been doing this for years as a way to limit my message. They'll post videos from terrorists, but my pictures of birds and butterflies get censored. This is the image which Twitter considered to be too sensitive for most people. It's a paragraph from the 1990 United Nations IPCC report. It says, "Satellite observations have been used to map sea ice extent routinely since the early 1970s. The American Navy Joint Ice Center has produced weekly charts which have been digitized by NOAA. In 1972 to 1975, sea ice extent was significantly less." In this image I combined the sea ice extent graph from the 1985 DOE report with the one from the 1990 IPCC report. It shows that Arctic alarmists start their sea ice graphs right at the century peak in 1979, and they hide all the data prior to that when sea ice extent was quite low. Mervin responded with, "One might ask, why are you relying on a 30-year-old report when there's been so much more robust science done since? But we know the answer." What Mervin is saying is that climate alarmists are allowed to throw out any historical data which disagrees with their agenda. They just declare that science is so much more robust now than it was back in the days when we were still able to send people to the moon. I see no evidence that climate science is an actual science, much less a robust one. He provided zero evidence to support the idea that the pre-1979 data was incorrect. His argument is based entirely on an unsupported appeal to authority. And then he said, "But we know the answer," referring to himself as plural. Once again, this is an attempt to make his baseless assertions sound more authoritative. Richard Feynman said, "Science is the belief in the ignorance of the experts." And Einstein said, "Blind trust in authority is the greatest enemy of the truth." And blind trust is exactly what drives climate alarmism. Climate alarmists don't seem to understand much about either science or the scientific process. So then Mervin posted the complete dataset going back to the early 1970s, which looks very different. This peak right here in 1979 is where Arctic alarmists now start their graphs. By doing this, they make Arctic sea ice extent look like a linear downwards trend, rather than the cyclical behavior which it actually is. Hiding the pre-1979 data is some of the worst fraud being perpetrated on the public. And Mervyn says that the data we collected back in the days when we were able to go to the moon was pretty basic and unreliable, and he provided zero evidence to support his blind assertion. So I responded with the CI satellite photos from the November 1976 issue of National Geographic. The images show tremendous detail of sea ice around Antarctica during January and July of 1976. The article says that the imagery was taken from Nimbus 5 satellites using microwave imaging techniques. These images show very clearly that there was a tremendous amount of detail in the ice records prior to 1979. Having been shown that his assertion about the quality of data was incorrect, Mervyn quickly tried to divert the conversation. He said, "Quick, quick, change the subject from Arctic sea ice to the other side of the world. Desperation." But the subject we were discussing was the quality of sea ice satellite data. I showed very clearly that there's no valid reason for alarmists to hide pre-1979 sea ice data. There's no reason to believe that the quality of the data at the North Pole would be any different than the quality of the data at the South Pole. The reason I used these images is because they're the ones that were used by National Geographic in the November 1976 issue. So I responded with, "That's the second most pathetic attempt at deflection I've seen today. You appear incapable of holding an honest discussion." And Mervyn wrote back, "It was you who deflected from the obvious loss of Arctic ice recently to an old report of Antarctic ice. Would you like to return to the topic, or perhaps to cite some newspaper cutting from the 1920s about cold winters and little snoring?" What Mervyn is saying is that climate alarmists choose to ignore any historical data which works against their agenda, no matter how high quality the data is shown to be. And Mervyn says that there's an obvious loss of Arctic sea ice recently, even though current extent is higher than 13 of the last 15 years. Mervyn's lame attempt at deflection wasn't working very well, and he got desperate. And someone else weighed in and said, "I asked Tony if he could identify the assets NASA had in polar orbit during that time frame. He's refused to answer. He might be a busy guy, or maybe I might have overwhelmed him. Silence speaks volumes." So I responded with, "I get several thousand messages a day, and I'm not particularly interested in your silly delusions of grandeur. All of the early CI satellite data came from Nimbus satellites, like this very detailed imagery from the November 1976 issue of National Geographic." And of course, Twitter tried to hide my very sensitive image of satellite sea ice. This is what I sent him, which stated very clearly that the imagery was from Nimbus 5 satellites using microwave imaging techniques. We've already looked at this image, but now we're going to look at it in a little bit more detail. National Geographic, November 1976. Microwave radiation images recorded by the Nimbus 5 satellite are color-coded to reveal differences in snow and water surfaces. So he responded with, "Nimbus, non-polar. Surely you know that you couldn't see polar ice using Nimbus. Thank you for your time and wrong answer. It's appreciated, and the low quality of the response speaks volumes." This is a standard technique used by climate alarmists. He had no idea what he was talking about, but made a very bold assertion. The National Geographic image which I sent him showed very clearly that the Nimbus 5 satellite was taking pictures of polar ice. But climate alarmists aren't interested in facts. He's simply trying to create a smokescreen. By making his nonsense sound very authoritative, he's hoping to confuse people watching the discussion. I responded back to him, "Had you bothered to read the National Geographic screenshot I sent you, you could have stopped digging your credibility hole, but it's too late now." And Twitter, of course, censored my image. The image said very clearly that it was a Nimbus 5 satellite. So he again tried to change the subject. He said, "That's okay. With your reputation, the more you attack, the better I come out of this." So me showing that he had no idea what he was talking about is an attack. And then he called me a bully. He tried to bully the conversation and failed, and then tried to project his own bullying onto me. But he wasn't done with his nonsense yet. Then he said, "How can you compare microwave measurements that can see through clouds over limited range visual and IR? Seems you prefer non-functional technology." What he's trying to say is that the 1976 images were not microwave images, even though the National Geographic article stated very clearly that they were. Then he said, "We didn't have polar orbiting microwave satellites before 1978, even though the November 1976 issue of National Geographic showed microwave radiation images." At that point I gave up on him and blocked him, but his conversation is fairly typical for a climate alarmist. He had no interest in facts. Mark Twain said, "Never tell the truth to people who are not worthy of it." And in no case is that more true than with climate alarmists. They're incapable of holding an honest discussion. The evidence is not on their side, and when I point this out to them, they choose to lie, cheat, and deflect. If they were honest scientists, they wouldn't be climate alarmists. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.